what we're doing in Monte Carlo is bringing best practices that have worked in DevOps and worked in engineering and bringing that along with the diligence and the process to data teams. Starting a company in a totally new category with a product that's never been built, a product that's never been sold, and a product that's never been used, you don't get anything for free.
All right, so hello everyone, and welcome to the AI Stories podcast. I'm Neil Leiser, I'm a data scientist at iWoka, and I will be your host. So today our guest is Barr Moses, the co-founder and CEO of Monte Carlo, the first end-to-end data observability platform. So before this, Barr also had some experiences at Gainsight and at Bain, and she studied mathematics and computer science at Stanford. If you enjoyed the episodes, please don't forget to subscribe to the AI Stories YouTube channel, leave a 5-star review, comment, and share the episodes. All right, so hello Barr, great to have you all the way from the US. First thing I want to know is how you actually got into this world of data science and AI. How did you get into the field?
Yeah, it's crazy to think how much the field has changed in the last couple of decades. I started my personal journey. I was actually born and raised in Israel. My dad is a physics professor, so I actually sort of spent my childhood in his lab, sort of building things and experimenting with things. My mom is a meditation and dance movement teacher, and so I sort of was experienced to both of those from an early age. And, my dad and I used to read a lot of books together on data, popular sort of science, et cetera. And I actually started sort of my career in the Israeli Air Force, sort of working with, data analysis for operational units. Later on studied math and stats. And really sort of basically fell in love with with math and the world of data. Later on, worked as a consultant, helping companies with their data. And so basically learned a lot about sort of working with, various industries and various business problems and using data to solve them. And then most recently I was, at a company that used data to help improve what we call customer success. So throughout my career, really work with data in different sort of formats and types, different purposes. And it's really outstanding to see how the industry has changed. We're really a far cry today from where we were, 15, 20 years ago.
Is it then in the army that you started to develop this passion for data science and data and maths and AI, and did this then led you to actually study maths and computer science at Stanford?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think sort of the passion and love for that probably started a little bit earlier on. So in high school and such, I studied physics as well, hung out a lot with my dad, kind of talking about that. Some of the books that we read together were, I don't know if you know Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which talks about how people process data and how people think about data. And later on he wrote about sort of judgment and bias and the role of intuition in data. So I've always kind of been passionate about that. And I think in the Army for sure, did definitely, I think, a lot of work with data and realized the importance of getting data right, the criticality of making sure that the data is accurate. A lot of the work that we did was serving data for operational units in the field who were making real-time decisions based on that data. And so seeing how important it is to get data right when people are using it, in near real time or in quite proximity, obviously made a lasting impression on me. And then, later on when, I was at Stanford, I really was, I loved all things data. My favorite class was actually a class called Mathemagics, where we sort of learned about the math behind magic tricks. And actually sort of, one of the projects was to create our own magic trick based on a mathematical equation or algorithm. And so, I've always sort of loved that, always kind of had a passion to it. Became sort of a full-time thing only later in my career.
Okay, and what are like the top, let's say, 2 or 3 lessons that you learned then in the army? You told me there was this thing about getting the data right. I guess the army is quite a particular setting because it's a very risky environment, and so data there should be quite different than data at Bain or at Monte Carlo. So what are the things you learned in the army in terms of data and lessons?
Yeah. So look, this was like, almost 20 years, I guess, by now. So the concept of what data science, data analyst was very, very different. Everything was really manual. Everything that we were doing around data analysis, right? It was definitely not anywhere near, you think about the tools and what we have today, let alone ChatGPT, right? Even if you look at the advantage in the last 4 months, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking about like the type of things that we used to do manually back then. They really look ridiculous right now. But I think that's one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing, and I'm really bullish on that, is like automation of the parts for data, data scientists, data analysts, data engineers. A lot of their job is manual, and we can actually automate some of those things and make data teams' lives easier. And I learned early on about how to do all the manual things, a lot of them. And so I think that was like one sort of big lesson. The other one was probably more on, sort of the people and leadership side. So I was very young. I was, 18 and a half years old. And, the people I was working with was 18 years old. And, we didn't have formal training when it came to data, right? So we didn't have, a master's degree or, we had some sort of classes and courses that we went through, but we were not professionals in data management, if you will. And yet, what I learned is when you bring together a group of people who are incredibly motivated and have a very specific mission ahead of them and have very targeted training around something, you really can accomplish amazing, incredible things together. And I think that serves as an inspiration to me still today when I look back and say like, wow, like, we were very young. We did not know very much. We had very little tools. Everything was manual, and yet we accomplished amazing things and really beat the odds. And I think that's an important lesson for, what we can do with data. Even if we're not the world's greatest experts on something, we can still make a contribution and make an impact.
So the importance of basically working with a great and motivated team. If you don't have a good team, even if you're very smart, you're not going to go very far.
I think that's right. I think, surrounding yourself by people who you want to be with and, who make you better every day, is something that I find very fulfilling. Yeah.
And the other thing you said, which I think is quite interesting, is the fact that it looks like your dad has been quite a big influence on you. Can you dig a bit more into this? What are the things that you learned from your dad? And is this thanks to your dad that you're now in the data and maths side of things?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for me, one of the things, both of my parents actually love what they do, and are incredibly passionate about what they do. And, they work a lot, both of them. My mom is an entrepreneur. She basically started her own business time and time again. And, my dad has his own lab, where he runs experiments and does research. And, so both of them, I think, kind of taught me to love what you do and kind of let everything else take care of itself, if you will. And, with my dad in particular, I think, again, at a very, very young age, I think working with him on, math problem sets or, kind of homework that I had made it really fun. And I think it also became, something that we just did together. So, there's sort of the idea of, guesstimate. There's actually a book called Guesstimate about making guesses with data. I don't know if you read that book. And, with my dad, it would be not uncommon when I was like maybe 5 years old or something. We would go to watch a movie. We'd go to cinema and my dad will be like, well, how many people are in the audience here? And I had to like really quickly make a guesstimate, like, okay, how many people in a row? About like 18 or 20. Okay, about how many people in a row? Okay, how many, how many rooms like these? Okay, approximately how many people are in the cinema? And as a young, like 5-year-old kid, like how quickly can you come up with that? Like that was so fun. I think, throughout the years sort of growing up, always kind of use data in day to day as well. And also in finding ways to make data approachable, right? Like another like fun example that I remember talking about with, my math professor, at Stanford was, what's the ideal way to organize your dishwasher in a way that like, for example, for the cutlery, do you put like all the, what's like the right algorithm to get like the cleanest dishes? Do you put all the dishes in one side that are the same? Do you mix and match the types of dishes? Do you put the knives with the spoons, or the knives separately and the spoons separately? Like what's the right, and like what's the optimal number? I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I think the idea is like data and numbers and math is kind of in everyday life. A lot of it has to do with having a passion for it and finding ways. Like, my dad studied, he was one of the pioneers of chaos theory, and actually like studied how like the movement of like how leaves fall to the ground, and what is that, what can you actually model what that looks like. And so, I look at nature, there's so much that, we can apply just by looking outside the window.
So what is the optimal way to sort your dishwasher? Did you find it out in the end?
Great question. I still think about it every time I fill the dishwasher and dig it out. I've not come up with the ideal. I'm still iterating on that.
So let's dig a bit more into your career. So you went to the army. Well, you had this early influence from your parents. You went to the army. You studied at Stanford, and then at some point you start working at Bain. You mentioned that you were still in the data strategist side of things at Bain. So yeah, can you touch a bit on what you did at Bain and how was this related to data?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say, joining Bain was for a couple of reasons. One, the Bain is sort of well known for great people. And I think this has to do with kind of what we talked about earlier, but, working with people who make you better, and who are passionate about what they do. And I definitely found that in folks that I work with at Bain, incredibly smart human beings. And, on the data side, the interesting thing was, I worked on a variety of different industries. So imagine, I could work for 1 month. I would be working on like helping a burger chain redo their pricing. And in another month, I could be working with a semiconductor company, helping them optimize their factories or their manufacturing. And in a third month, I could be working, with our M&A team on helping make a decision, whether a particular company should acquire another company or not. So the variety of industries and the variety of work that we worked on was very, very different. I think one of the fun things about that was that we got to see and do a lot of different things, right? And, you're also being pushed, because I didn't know anything about semiconductors or M&A or burger chains for that matter. And here I am needing to make recommendations and decisions based on, honestly, not a lot of experience and not a lot of data. Like, you have a few weeks to get up to speed on the industry, and you need to become the expert on how to price a burger chain accurately, or what's the best way to optimize a semiconductor manufacturing line. Like, that's not obvious. And for someone with no background in that, yet you have to make recommendations based on it, that's tough. And you have to do it again, again, and again. And you get good with a lot of practice at understanding really quickly what are the important things in this industry, what are the leverage points that you have, and what are the tough questions to ask. And I learned that by watching other people do that. And I think, in all of these instances, there's a lot of data that you do. I'll give you an example. You do a lot of data, there's like survey-based data that you could do. So you could actually like survey population to learn, what are their preferences about particular burger chains. Or, maybe the easiest example is, what's your NPS for the top 5 burger chains? Like, how would you rank, I don't know, McDonald's, Burger Ranch, In-N-Out, and a couple others, right? And then ask questions about that. And there's a lot of data that you can collect and, do a lot more research, that can inform a burger chain about, their strategy, their pricing, the personas that they go after, the segment of the population that they go after, the offerings that they give to each. So there is, quite a lot of data that you can collect. There's also data that you can analyze about the company itself, right? You can look at the business units, the business performance, forecasts, projections, etc. And yet, at the end of the day, you have to make a lot of strategy decisions that have nothing to do with the data. Because there's very little data about the future. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things that, I had the pleasure of watching and learning from people who had, 20 to 25 years of experience doing this and being able to look at all the data and understand all the recommendations. And then at the end of the day, make a strategy-based decision about the future that actually doesn't have the answer in the data. And I learned that you could take the data and tell yourself whatever story you want, based on the data. And so, it's really, really important to understand, what problem are you trying to solve with the data that you're looking at? And being really specific about, what outcome you're hoping for, and also recognizing that oftentimes some of the hardest questions just don't have data to answer. And leadership and, building great businesses is, I think, about making those decisions without data or with the best data that you have at the time, which is often imperfect.
How do you make a decision when you don't have data? What's your strategy to do that? How do you make sure you can make a good decision without looking at what happened in the past or past experiences? Basically, no data.
It's a great question. Someone gave me advice a long time ago. They said, don't listen to advice, because advisors often only know, sort of the last war, so to speak, right? Or they only know the last scene, but they don't actually know the future. And you need to be winning the future. And so I'm not quite answering your question. I'm not sure I know, how to do that. I think a lot of it, I think there's some things that are helpful. One is definitely actually reading history and reading the stories of, if it's a particular, situation or scenario that you're in, learning about other instances where folks have dealt with similar questions that you have had. And learning from that. So I actually think you can learn a ton from that. I love reading, lots of books, both about data leaders and founders and, sort of other political and sort of world leaders. I think you learn a ton from that. I think the other thing is, for me, it's about trusting, knowing that your customers know the answer. More than anything. And so oftentimes, when you make those decisions, you want to sort of, turn inward and ask yourself, what do I think? And what does my gut tell me? Which I think there's a role for your gut. But, as Danielle Kahneman might teach us, our gut is often wrong. And I think when it comes to data, the customer is always right, or it almost always is right. And so focusing in on what are our customers telling us, not what we think is the answer, not what we think we would do, but rather what are our customers doing, and being really, really sort of aggressive in, if you're not the customer, then you're probably not, you're not the right person to have an opinion on this. And that includes myself.
Oh, that's a super good point, actually, to focus on the customer, because in the end, you're building a product for them. And so if they're unhappy, your product is just not going to succeed. I want to ask something on, still on your experience at Bain. You mentioned something interesting, that you actually need to quickly become an expert in something that you basically don't know about, like semiconductors or the burger chain or whatever. How do you do to become an expert within a couple of weeks and even make recommendations and help people who are actually the experts in this topic or in this field? How do you do to become an expert very quickly?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. First of all, there's a team around you, right? So, I was sort of first year, second year there. So definitely, was more the learning. I was learning a lot more than I was contributing, I bet. And I'm very grateful for that. But there's a team around you of people who have done this for a very long time and who have strong intuition and have seen this movie many, many, many times. And I think that's true also, for me today, surrounding myself with those people who have seen the movie and can kind of show you around the corner or sort of tell you what's ahead. So I think that's definitely one thing that's helpful. I think the other thing that's maybe is kind of, powerful is there is something that's compelling about being an outsider to a space. Oftentimes when you are in a particular space, you don't always see what's outside. But when you bring that outsider perspective, you can actually like beat expectations, I think, and see things differently. So like, I'll give you another example. I think in particular, I can talk later about Monte Carlo, but one of the things that we do at Monte Carlo is, or kind of the category that we're pioneering is a category called data observability. And the idea is it's a corollary to software observability. And, I remember before we started the company, we talked to many people and sort of asked many people what are their thoughts about observability. And oftentimes data teams didn't have engineering background, and so they weren't familiar with concepts of observability, or they weren't familiar with tools like App Dynamics or New Relic or Datadog. And so it was a totally new concept for them. And, when I was talking to engineers and they were like, oh, of course you would need something like that for your data as well. And so there was something really powerful about bringing concepts from engineering to data, but that's something that you can only do with an outsider perspective. And so when I'm sort of reflecting back on my time as a consultant, I think, yes, it's definitely not the same as sort of, being in the decision maker seat and kind of making the decisions yourself. But there is, I think, a perspective in what an outsider can bring, which might sort of spark ideas that you haven't thought of before, or might be based on experience across different industries that you can learn from that's actually not obvious to someone who's sort of in it day in and day out.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think something quite similar is when you're junior in a company, like if you join a company as a junior data scientist, very often those junior will be afraid of sharing ideas or sharing their vision. They will just listen to what the senior or the managers have to say, and they will be afraid to share their vision. And I think that's a big mistake just because of what you mentioned, this outsider view that you're junior, you don't, but you also have some advantages, and there are some things that you can share. For example, you haven't been in the company for a long time, so you have some other vision of the world. Usually people who have been in the company for a long time, they kind of know the processes inside out, and they don't really think outside the box. So I think if you're junior, first of all, you're fresh, you're new, you're younger, you've got another vision, but also because you're just joining the company, you have quite a lot of things that you can add. And I think not sharing your ideas is a big mistake. Obviously you should listen to senior management if you want to progress, but you can also share what you have in mind. I don't know if you agree with this one.
I 100% agree. Actually, the first day I joined, I joined a startup. And by the way, I think this is something that's also unique to startups in particular. They can allow for even more of that. I think the first week I joined Gainsight, which is the startup that I was prior to Monte Carlo, I was like, okay, so like, what's the Gainsight way? Like, how should I do things here? What's important to know? And I remember my boss was like, forget all that shit. Like, you do your thing. You're here. So what if you're here only just a few days? Like, you were hired because we want to hear your opinion and because we want to see what you can bring, not so that you can like fit to some mold. And I believe in that so truly. Like when people start, it doesn't matter if you've been here a day or 100 days. It doesn't matter if you have 1 year or 3 years of experience or 30 years of experience. Your opinion matters. You were hired because what you do matters and because you matter. And so your ability to speak, yeah, you might be wrong. Okay, that's fine. But you're never going to learn if you don't actually speak up. And so I 100% agree with that. I also think as organizations, I am so grateful to new people who have opinions and can express them, because it's the only way that we learn. Otherwise, we're in this echo chamber and we keep telling ourselves we're amazing and blah, blah, blah. But then you have a new person, you're like, hey, fuck that shit. Excuse my French. That isn't working and you should do something totally different. And you're like, oh, thank God that you told me that. I would have never known if I didn't get that new perspective. Like, I think that's what diversity of thought and perspective brings, and we should celebrate that. So yes, if you just joined, please speak up.
Yeah, definitely people will be scared of making mistakes, and maybe junior people would do more mistakes than others. But yeah, I agree with you that that's the only way to learn. If you never make mistakes, you're probably not learning fast enough.
Totally.
But yeah, so we talked about, well, you worked at Bain, you then joined Gainsight, and after that you actually decided to launch Monte Carlo. You're now the co-founder and CEO of Monte Carlo. So let's dive into this a bit. First of all, what is Monte Carlo and why did you decide to launch this company?
Great question. So I'll start with your second question. So why did I decide to start? So I mentioned, we talked about how, I was in data, and my prior company, Gainsight, I was the person responsible for data that we were using both internally. Like, for example, we were doing like a churn analysis to understand, companies that have churned why, and, try to find like leading indicators that can help us predict churn, for example. So, we would use that pretty regularly, or, our marketing team would use data. And then we actually started sharing data with our customers. So we would have dashboards that we would make available for our customers to see their own data. And in many of those instances, the data was wrong. And I would get like WTF emails every Monday morning. I would wake up and people would be like, hey, Barr, why is the data wrong? Or the data looks a little bit off, like what's happening? And that experience was really frustrating for a few reasons. First of all, I'm like, I had one job, which is get the numbers right. And it was really, really freaking hard to do it. And the second was, I wasn't even the first person to uncover the problem. I was hearing about it from other people, and they were telling me the data is wrong, which was incredibly frustrating. And then the third thing that was hard was the being able to pinpoint what was the problem and figure out the path to resolution was incredibly hard, because everything was stitched together in a way that's like required us to basically like watch the data flowing from step to step and make sure that's accurate throughout throughout the pipelines, basically. So we had to start all the way from the source throughout various transformations, ETLs, etc., through data lake, data warehouse, and then the BI. And the data could go wrong anywhere along the steps. So we basically had to like set up these like ad hoc manual checks throughout the way to make sure that even if the job is completed, the data is still actually right. And that was incredibly manual. Like when something was wrong, like go figure, what went wrong and why. And when I was looking at my engineering counterparts, they had all these amazing solutions to make sure that applications were reliable, but there was nothing to help data teams make sure that data products were reliable. So that was kind of my personal experience, which left me very frustrated. And so, I decided to leave Gainsight and start my own company, and actually spoke to hundreds of leaders asking them about their experiences with this problem, and learned that it's a widespread problem that's actually becoming worse. So I'll give you a couple examples. Like, Netflix was down in 2016 for 45 minutes because of duplicate data. 45 minutes is a long time for Netflix to be down because of bad data. You can watch like a full episode of something in 45 minutes. Right? Or like, for example, Unity is a gaming company. They published that one data issue actually cost them $100 million. Just one, it was related to their ad data. And just one problem was like, just wrapping our head around that, like the cost of one data issue could be $100 million is crazy. And then, maybe like the third example that I would use is like Equifax credit score company. And they published that they actually shared or that they gave out incorrect credit scores based on wrong data. That means, there's like millions of users out there that their ability to take loans or mortgages or whatnot is impacted by it. And so it was clear to me that the impact of wrong data is becoming worse over time, and that we actually have to treat it with the diligence that it demands. the good news was that we could actually, take advantage of what engineering has figured out and bring it over. So, very briefly, Monte Carlo, pioneered and is leading the data observability category. We have several hundred customers, including folks like PagerDuty, Gusto, JetBlue, New York Times, many others. We have amazing team members from some of the best data and infrastructure companies out there. And really our mission is to help accelerate the adoption of data by reducing what we call data downtime, which is periods of time when your data is wrong or inaccurate.
Okay, no, that makes sense. That's super clear. And I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned one company basically had one data issue and it cost them $100 million or whatever. I don't know, it was euros of dollars. How do you explain that? How can just a single data issue be so costly?
Great question. So, while they're not going into a ton of details, as is expected, just to give you a sense of what it could look like, if you have a marketing campaign that's hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're actually you have a mistake in that marketing campaign. So maybe you're addressing the wrong people, you're targeting the wrong people, or maybe you even have the wrong price. So there's, we've seen instances where, companies mistakenly overpriced or underpriced a particular item. You can easily lose millions of dollars based on a mistake like that. And, the way that you measure, sort of discount codes that went unnoticed or, ROI on marketing campaigns that just went wrong. That's the type of stuff that the budget that's being, relying on that data, is so massive that really any small mistake can cause that. In this particular issue, Unity, it's a gaming company. And so a lot of their business is based on ad revenue. And this was a particular problem with advertising data, which led to that mistake.
And so more concretely, how does Monte Carlo help solve this data issue? I guess it would probably monitor the data in some way, but data is a very vague and it can be anywhere. There are lots of places where you can store data. So yeah, I'm curious how does this help company and how does this work in a bit more details?
Yeah. We just we wave a magic wand and all of your data is perfect forever. No, I'm kidding. I wish I've never seen a company that said, my data is 100% perfect. I also don't think that we'll see that, but, and that's also not what Monte Carlo is trying to do. What we're doing in Monte Carlo is bringing best practices that have worked in DevOps and worked in engineering and bringing that along with the diligence and the process to data teams. So specifically, the goal of observability solution like Monte Carlo is to make sure that data teams are the first to know about data issues. So reduce time to detection. Second is help data teams reduce time to resolution. So make sure that they're not spending, weeks or months trying to figure out the root cause. And the third is actually preventing data issues from happening to begin with. Now, the question is, how do we actually do that? And there's probably, two sort of more tactical things to discuss. The first is, what kind of data do you integrate with? And, what kind of data storage do you work with? And so, we talked about how data has changed in the last few years. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, you had one big data warehouse or, maybe it was SAP or Oracle and you dumped all of your data there. And you just need to make sure that the data that you're dumping in is clean and it looks great and that's it. And you kind of could forget about it. But today, to your point, data, and as I mentioned, data could be wrong everywhere, right? So you have, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pipelines. You could have multiple data warehouses. You could have a data lake. You could have multiple BI solutions, various orchestrators. Data could be in various different, places sort of along the chain, could be inaccurate. And so actually, what we believe a strong data observability solution will integrate with your tech stack end to end. At Monte Carlo, we integrate with a modern data stack. That's a buzzword, but I will use it nonetheless. And so that basically means that we connect to your data warehouse, like if you have Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift. or Databricks or S3, more on the data lake side. We'll connect to, DBT or Airflow or Fivetran. And then we'll connect to, Looker or Tableau or Power BI, and actually help you make sure that your data is healthy in each of those places, and give you a holistic view of your data. The definition of data observability is understanding the health of your data based on its outputs. And so we believe that if you connect your data stack end to end and monitor the outputs in a proactive way, you can identify changes and help your data team be aware of those and tackle issues before they impact downstream consumers. And so the first part is, what do you actually connect to? And then the second part is, how do you actually do it? And by the way, what should you monitor? Like, every teams and every organization has different data, and the data is different. And also, we know our data better than you. So how are you going to tell us if the data is healthy? Like, we know that better. Right? A lot of questions that we got when we started the company. And so, I think as folks who had experience with sort of engineering, DevOps, and SecOps, for SREs, for example, if I'll take the engineering world for a second, SREs have clear things that they are watching to make sure that applications and infrastructure is reliable and that there's sufficient uptime, right? Like 5 nines or whatnot. And for data teams, we needed to come up with that. We didn't know what to measure. And so we actually, I mentioned we spoke with like hundreds of people and actually interviewed them. What does data look like when it goes wrong? And what do you do about it? And from those conversations, actually, like, similarities and patterns came up. So, for example, a lot of people told us, we really rely on third-party data a lot, and that data is late, and they never tell us that. So, for example, we have a report that goes out at 8 a.m., and at 6 a.m., we need data from Facebook or Meta now, or FICO, or whatever it is, third party that needs to send us data, and the data just doesn't come, and we don't even know about that. That's something that came up a ton. Another thing that came up was, someone on the engineering team way upstream made a schema change and didn't let me know about it. Like, for example, they changed the type of a field, or they just deleted a field and didn't think to let me know about it. And all of my reports are now broken because there's this one field that I was using that's not reliant on. Or, for example, someone would say, a particular job that runs every day was completed and everything was fine, but suddenly I noticed that all the data is null values, basically. And I was expecting to have, credit cards number there. And now there's just null values. But nothing failed. The job completed. So I wasn't even aware. And I learned about it only later when we tried to charge those customers and didn't have credit card numbers, right? So all of those stories came up again and again. And what we did is we actually put together sort of what we call the 5 pillars of data observability, which capture all of the reasons, or, sort of 80% of the reasons for why data goes wrong. And we believe that by automating the monitoring and using that to increase awareness and bring metadata and context for data teams, they can actually, better detect, resolve, and prevent issues. And so, just to go in a little bit more depth into what these 5 pillars are, the first is freshness. So basically, is your data arriving on time? And doing that for hundreds of thousands of tables at scale is hard, because some tables get updated 3 times an hour and some tables get updated, Monday through Friday, but not on the weekend. And so doing that at scale and doing that automatically without someone on the data team having to specify which hour each table should get updated is super important. So the first pillar is really freshness of the data. And that is one of the biggest reasons for why data is wrong. The second is volume, which is closely related to freshness. But, there's different ways to measure the volume of the data. But basically, if over time you have, consistent number of rows that's growing, and suddenly you have half the number of rows that you expected, something's wrong. Maybe data is getting deleted. You need to know about that. Again, hard to do at scale. Seems very obvious, but it's actually really hard to detect. The third pillar is schema changes. So, any changes in the structure of data. I mentioned an example where a field was deleted, or maybe a table was deleted, any set of changes like that might have, consequential downstream issues that you were unaware of. The fourth pillar is what we call quality. And that has to do with sort of kind of field level changes. So I give an example as a high level of null rates that you were unexpectedly seeing in the data. Or, for example, let's see, if we're going back to the Equifax let's say there's a particular, range that you expect for a score, like let's say 200 to 800, and suddenly, you see the number 1600 there. Something's probably wrong. I'm not sure you'll ever get an alert on that, especially if you don't set up a manual test, but setting up a manual test for every single field doesn't make sense. So, the fourth pillar really focuses on changes at what we would call the field quality level. And then the fifth pillar is around lineage. And by lineage, I mean both table and column level lineage. And lineage, an automatic view of the lineage, both sort of across, we talked about across different data systems, so data warehouse, data lake, ETL, and BI, being able to tie that entire story together and say, hey, someone made a schema change upstream here, which led to a freshness problem here, which led to this table having incorrect data, which led to this report being wrong, and it's now being used by this person. Being able to have that view is incredibly helpful, both for understanding whose impact downstream, but also what are the upstream culprits, if you will, that are contributing to this problem. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, quite a detailed answer. I'm curious, do you have some kind of, how is your solution in a nutshell? Is it like a software that basically monitors all those 5 pillars based on different data sets? Do you have dashboards? What if there is an issue? Do you send an alerting to someone, or can I see this on a graph? How does this work in terms of visualization?
All of the above. I also will say that I think this is fascinating because it's a totally new product, right? It's never been built before. It's not like there's something else that, we can take inspiration from. Again, we take inspiration from, observability solutions that engineers use. Right. So the best way to think about this is just like Datadog, but for your data teams and for the data itself. And so, just to give a couple examples, but the way that you could interface with something like that is you start with Slack. You get a notification on Slack or email or PagerDuty. Hey, there's really high percentage of nulls in a particular field. You might want to see what's happening. By the way, the downstream implications of this field being wrong are multiple reports that are going to hit your CEO's inbox tomorrow morning. So you probably want to take a look at this. This is probably like a P0 severity, for example. And then, you can navigate through that and see, okay, what exactly is happening with this field? Were there any historical incidents related to that? Are there any other sort of tables or sort of fields or issues that are failing that are correlated to this at the same time? And actually having the ability to actually really get an understanding of what are all the details around this incident that can help me understand what's failing and why. So that's kind of at the, specific alert level. You could also zoom out and have a dashboard that says, what percentage of our data assets arrive on time according to some SLA that we define, right? Maybe, last year, 80% of our data arrived on time and 99% of it arrives on time today. So we've improved significantly as a team. And, you could also look at what's our time to detection, right? So, if in the past it was a couple of days and now we've reduced it to a couple of hours. So you could actually look at a dashboard that tells you that, gives you that insight over time. So, I think there's various ways that you actually can interact with it. What we try to do is to make it easy as possible to work with and to integrate with sort of the day-to-day of data engineers and data engineering managers who, at the end of the day, are held accountable to data quality standards and to making sure that the data that they are sharing with their consumers is accurate and reliable and can be trusted.
What was your biggest challenge trying to build this tool and, this company overall? What was the most difficult thing?
It's a good question. I will say, starting a company in a totally new category with a product that's never been built, a product that's never been sold, and a product that's never been used, you don't get anything for free. Nothing is easy. Getting your first customer is really hard. Getting your first employee is really hard. Why would anyone leave their job and come join you on some imaginary journey? And getting, your first funding is really hard. I don't think I was even able to explain what we were doing in the early days. I'm not sure people really understood. Most of the feedback I got was, hey, observability is a really difficult word to pronounce. You might want to reconsider the term, right? So, I think starting a company, and in particular a new category, all of those things are really hard. I think the things that give us inspiration along the way is our amazing customers. We actually every time, we kind of once a year, we publish sort of something called the pioneers of data reliability. These are data teams that basically, revamped how they think about data quality internally and totally changed the way that they work. I think that's really hard to do. And the fact that so many organizations have adopted that so quickly is such an inspiration to me. So I don't know if that's a cop-out answer to your question, but basically everything is hard. You don't get anything for free, but we do have a value around that at Monte Carlo. It's called beat the odds, which basically means we thrive on doing things that seem impossible and hard. We don't shy away from them. We go in and, we show up, we're in the arena and we're fighting to do this. And, I think what's most important to us is if we go back to our mission, I don't think people can actually use data if the data is inaccurate. And so for us, that's kind of the thing that makes it easier for me, right? I can't imagine a world where we're using data and the data is wrong. And, there's a lot of talk about, kind of generative AI and all that stuff. And, people lose trust when when the output quality is incorrect or wrong or biased. And so I think there's probably nothing more important for us to work on than this mission.
So do you see the importance of data growing a lot over the next few years? And do you see lots of new companies around the data space getting created?
I do. I'm very bullish about the importance of data. What could be more important in the next 5 to 10 years? I can't imagine a world where data is not more important. I literally can't. And I think as a result of that, there's a lot of responsibility that lies on data teams. Data scientists, data engineers, data analysts need to make sure that we're working on things that are adding value to the business and, that we are furthering humanity with data. I think, that is important. But I really can't envision a world where data becomes less important. I'm very, very bullish about, the future, for data. I do think there's been, this sort of surge of companies and startups that are here to help make the lives of data teams easier. And I think that's good. I think that will make data teams more productive and more effective. And so I'm sort of pleased to see that. But then again, I'm not, in the future of forecasting. I'm not in the business of forecasting. So difficult for me to know exactly, but, I'm very, very bullish about the future of data in general.
What's your take then on those super large and big models, which take, millions, billions of data to train, big models that we don't really understand? I don't know if we know a lot about what is the quality of this data. What's your take on this? Do you see a danger in this?
I don't know. It's actually a timely question. I think earlier this morning, was it published that Elon Musk and a few other folks sent a note to kind of warn about the future of AI? Is that right? I actually wasn't able to read the full sort of detail there. But, I'm, obviously following this just like everyone else. I think it's, quite astonishing how in the last few months, how much has changed in such a short amount of time. I think from my personal efforts to use ChatGPT, it's released some pretty hilarious responses. So I'm not sure that I'm quite ready for it to fully replace me, or any other data professional for that matter. I think there's, more that we have to do on the technology, but, I'm generally an optimistic person and I do see the value. And, I think there's been a lot of improvements, right? I think even the ability, I think this was just with the recent release of, the most latest version ChatGPT, you can now look at the history in the last few years. Up until then, it was sort of, I think there was a cutoff in 2020 or something like that. So it's obviously getting, a lot better. But I think it's very early days. So I think time will tell. Hard for me to kind of know where we go from here. But I was curious to see that, that sort of, response earlier today from, folks warning about the future. So curious to track that.
So 2 questions on your career overall before we finish the episode. The first one, well, you've done quite a lot already. We mentioned the army, studying at Stanford, Bain, Gainsight, now launching your own startup. What's the biggest mistake you've made or the biggest lesson you learned from all those years?
I mean, look, I would say there's like plenty of mistakes I've made along the way. Like I always say, like the very first thing that we built in our product, I was sure that no one was going to use it, and it was a hit. And vice versa. There's like one feature that I was so bullish about. I was like, everyone is going to use this. This is the most important. And like nobody cares about it. Still today, like 4 years later, nobody's using that. And so I was like blatantly wrong. So, I think there's, thank God we have like great team members around me who, can correct and cover for that. But, I think if there's sort of themes to that, maybe there's sort of 2 themes. One is listen to customers. I think the mistake that I made and continue to make is it is very easy to forget about that. And it's easy to like drift to, your internal head and your internal drama and, different opinions. But the reality is ask your customers, talk to your customers, whatever it is, that is where the answer lies. Not in your head, not in your competition, not in someone else, not in the future, in what your customers say to here and now. And I think any mistake that I've made was related to that, to losing sight of that. And then, the second thing that I've learned is, people always ask me like, what's your advice? And I really say like, don't listen to advice. I think for every question that I had, I could probably find like 10 people that would tell me yes and 10 people that would tell me no, depending on their experiences, the scars on their back, what they thought, etc. But at the end of the day, like you have to listen to your customers, listen to the data, see what you have, and look inwards to yourself to think, okay, what can I learn from this? The answer is not with any advice that you'll get outside. And I think that's, something that's been very helpful to realize. And it's also empowering, to know.
So if you had just one advice for someone to progress in their career, what would it be? Would it be this one? Don't listen to advice, or do you have another one?
Maybe the second one is like, just do it. I think oftentimes people are kind of not sure, should I do this or should I do that? Oftentimes just doing it reveals the answer. Like just ship it. See what customers say. Just try one path. See if it works. Just take that course. See if you like it or not. Just ask that question. Voice that opinion. If you just, like, I think my advice is like, go and do those things, and then you'll see what the world looks like and how things, and you'll also learn that it's not as scary as it is to just do it. You'll probably make mistakes. You'll fail along the way. You'll be wrong the entire time, but at least like you're putting yourself out there. There's that, quote, Theodore Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena. And, it's the credit goes to the man in the arena who strives valiantly. And, even if they err or fail, they do it while daring greatly. I really sort of, like that. The quote is much longer and I'm kind of bastardizing it, but, I think that really speaks to me about, and, I think about that quote a lot, about how to, being the arena and daring greatly, is really core to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I guess the difficult thing is there are so many things you could do. Like there are 1,000 courses you could take, 1,000 books you could read, and you sometimes kind of get paralyzed by the amount of things you could be doing at a single point in time. And well, obviously internet doesn't help because you could watch a video, you could, chat with your friends online. So I feel like it's getting more and more difficult to actually do things.
That's a good point. I did not have that problem when I grew up. I don't think I had a cell phone until very late. So, that's definitely, more of a now problem. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's something that I struggle a lot with too in terms of focus. I think speed and focus are one of the most important things for a startup. I actually, my team meetings are called speed and focus to remind ourselves of what's important. I try to, narrow down what I'm doing to less and less, sort of fewer things, and same for the company and for my teams. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's a way to like ruthlessly prioritize, but I agree with you. You definitely don't want to do everything all at once. Not sure if that would work.
Yeah, I think it's also thinking about not trying to find like the optimal thing. Like I think a lot of people, you basically stop doing things because you try to find the optimal book or the optimal course. But I agree with your advice. Just take one and do it and see how it goes. Because if you start to question yourself, you'll never find the optimal course or optimal book. So just pick one and go for it.
I totally agree. And oftentimes the answer will reveal itself. Like sometimes you're like in your head trying to like figure out what to do and you're like, just take that first course and you'll see, you'll know if it's good or not. Like you'll get started. You're not going to know if you don't get started.
Well, Barr, thanks a lot. It was great to record this episode with you. Have a great day in the US and yeah, hope to catch up soon.
Thanks so much, Neil. Appreciate the questions.
Thank you.